What is going on, everyone? It's your boy Knight, and today we are going to be taking a look at the Shoto / all-arounder archetype for fighting games. Shotos and all-rounders are usually the beginner-friendly characters, so I thought there'd be no better place to start than to explain what they do, what their game plan is, and what really makes a Shoto character, since I know fighting game terminology can be a little confusing for some of the newer players. So first off, I should probably mention that the word Shoto is technically unique to the Street Fighter series, where in Street Fighter they're kind of called Shotos, and in other games they're mostly called all-arounders, but these type of characters are all made up of the same components, which I'll get to in just a second. The word Shoto comes from the word Shotokan, which is a style of karate used by the main character and a couple of the villains in the Street Fighter series, hence the abbreviation to Shoto. But what does this really mean? Well, a Shoto character kind of comes packaged with three things that is really character defining, or I guess archetype defining in this case. That means they come packaged with a fireball or a basic projectile, a DP or dragon punch. In the Street Fighter case, these are normally called shoryukens, and a tatsu or hurricane kick, which is a advancing aggressive combo tool. I don't really know what else to say to it, but it's you'll understand what I mean in just a second. I should probably mention before we start that, I mean, technically not all Shotos are all-arounders, and not all-arounders are Shotos, but that's a little bit more complicated thing. For a general idea, if you want to be in on a bit of like the fighting game lingo, I guess, for the most part, we call Shotos this archetype in specifically Street Fighter, and in other games, you generally refer to them as all-rounders, even though they kind of all have the same tools, which we should probably get into now. The first defining move of this archetype is the Hadouken, Fireball, or whatever your basic projectile is. It depends on the game. Today, we're going to be specifically using Street Fighter 6 Ryu as our prime example, since I mean he is the Shoto character. So the Fireball, what is the point of it? Why is this move useful? If you're a newer player and you're playing against your friends using a lot of fireballs, they might be calling you a dirty spammer or something of the likes, but in the fighting game community, that's what we like to call a scrub quote, and really, spamming fireballs early is never a terrible idea. The point of the fireball is that your opponent has to react to it, and how they react to it can actually give you a lot of information on your opponent's playstyle and habits. Using Street Fighter 6 as an example, your opponent can react to your fireball with a block, a crouch block, they could jump over it, they could parry it, or they could perfect parry it. This will kind of let you know what your opponent's habit is, so let's throw in an example. Let's say you throw 3 fireballs at your opponent, and they decide they want to jump over every single one. Well, now you kind of understand what your opponent's going to do, so when you're playing the neutral game, you can be pretty much sure that they're going to jump in on you at some point and have your hands already ready on whatever your anti-air is, or on your DP, which again, we'll talk about in a little bit. Let's say you throw 3 fireballs and your opponent crouch blocks all of them. You can kind of get an idea that they're a bit more of a defensive player, and maybe throwing some grabs into your game plan is probably going to be better versus that opponent. Throwing fireballs is really just a way to make your opponent react to something, and they're generally pretty safe. That's why people spam throw them a lot, especially early on in the round. Certain fireballs can be thrown at different speeds depending on if you hit the light, medium, or heavy button, and some fancier characters like Akuma, for example, can do fancier fireballs that have more hits, etc, etc. That's all fancy stuff, but for the most part, you throw the fireball to make your opponent do something, and then you get information depending on what they do. Of course, throwing too many fireballs will make you very obvious, and your opponent will understand that they can probably just jump over it and hit you, so you do have to be careful with how much you use them, but using fireballs for pressure and information is always a good idea, so make sure to incorporate them. Don't feel like a dirty spammer. You're kind of doing the right thing. Shotos and all-arounders are meant to be adaptable. They have a little bit of zoning, they have a little bit of rushdown, they have a little bit of everything. Your fireball, for instance, if your opponent is a zoner, you can match their fireball game with yours and cancel it out. If your opponent is weak to long-range pressure, you can throw fireballs, forcing them to react and make it hard for them to get in. If your opponent's a big guy that you don't want near you, you guessed it, fireballs are the answer. So it's always a good tool to have, but it wouldn't be anything without the second thing that makes a Shoto, and that being a a DP or invincible reversal. In Street Fighter, this move is typically Shoryuken, but it is normally called a DP or Dragon Punch in every other game, and it gets that name from, I think, Shoryuken translating to Dragon Punch, and it's the one that makes the Z motion on your controller that a lot of people have a hard time pulling off when they first start playing fighting games. So why is this move so important? Arguably, out of the three things that make up a Shoto or all-arounder, I'd say the DP is probably the most important and most useful, but what does it do? So the thing with the DP is it's an anti-air, but it's also an invincible reversal. What does that mean? It means if someone presses a button and you use your DP, you will pretty much always win the exchange and hit them out of whatever they're doing. For example, because the Dragon Punch has invincibility frames, let's say your opponent knocks you down, and the first thing you do when you get up is throw a DP. If your opponent pressed pretty much any attack button on their controller, they are now getting launched 6 feet into the air because your move is an invincible reversal. You can kind of throw them out sometimes, but for the most part, you want to use this move as an anti-air. If your opponent's getting a little too comfortable jumping in on you, a couple of DPs should put them back in their place. Other than being an anti-air, as I mentioned before, using a DP the second you get off the ground is risky because if your opponent blocks it, you're a sitting duck, but if they tend to be a person that just can't help but hitting a bunch of buttons, normally your DP will catch them on wake up, or in other words, whenever you get off the ground, and you'll pretty much stop their pressure, and it's kind of just a get off me tool. That's really a good way of looking at it. So you have your fireball and you have your DP. The last part that makes up the Shoto archetype is a Tatsu or Hurricane Kick. This doesn't really have another term when you translate it to other fighting games. They all have the move, but it's just like an advancing forward aggressive move that can be used in combos. I don't really know what else to call it, but specifically in Street Fighter, it is normally called a Tatsu, and also kind of specifically in Street Fighter, for a little bit of this move, it will make you projectile invincible, which means you'll go through certain fireballs, so just kind of remember that if you're messing around. But a Tatsu is pretty much that. It's a move that sends you forward and does damage. You can use it in combo. In Street Fighter, you can use it to go through projectiles. Some other games, that's not quite the case, but that is pretty much the Shoto archetype. You have your fireball, your get off me tool or your DP, and you have your Tatsu for pressure or combos. And while the moves might be called different things in other games, having a projectile, an invincible reversal, and a gap closing aggressive move is pretty much the fundamentals for what makes a Shoto or all-arounder character. But now that you know what the moves are, how exactly do you apply them to your game to play this basic archetype? Well, lucky for most new players, it's really quite simple and quite effective. You throw fireballs to force them to react. If they go to jump over them, you hit them with your anti-air or your DP, and if they're dealing with your fireballs in other ways, you use them to figure out what kind of playstyle your opponent has and react accordingly. If they seem to be a defensive player, you can start getting in, start doing some combos, grow for some throws, and that's where your Tatsu can come into play to help you get in a little bit better. And if they seem like they're a super aggressive player just rushing at you, that's when you can start checking them with more projectiles or your jabs. So it's really about figuring out what your opponent's doing and reacting, which is kind of the core of fighting games in general, which is why Shotos and all-arounders are generally seen as what's called honest characters, meaning they're not abusing any crazy gimmicks, they're just playing the fundamentals of fighting games, and the better you are at the fundamentals, the better you're going to be at these characters. That's why I always recommend them to new players, and they're good even at high level. It's not like they fall off. The better you are at fundamentals, the better you'll be at the game, and the more you play these characters, the better your fundamentals will become. I should also mention that a lot of games have Shoto variations, where it has the same 3 core concepts, but sometimes a little different or more aggressive or defensive. To give an example, in Street Fighter, Ryu is the main Shoto of the game, but his duo Ken is also a Shoto, but in a more aggressive playstyle. He has moves that are more geared toward offense, while Ryu is generally seen as a more defensive character than Ken. You also have stuff like Akuma, that's like a glass cannon Shoto, Evil Ryu, who's somewhere in the middle, Goken, Oni. It's kind of a mess, but just know different games have Shotos that can do different things or are more geared towards a specific playstyle, usually one being a more aggressive type of Shoto and one being more defensive or balanced. To make sure you're following me, we're going to go through the principles one more time, and then I'll show you a comparison in another game so you can kinda see what I mean and make sure you're following. So, what do Shotos have? They have a fireball or a standard projectile. They have a DP or an invincible reversal. For you newer players, again, that's more of a get off me tool. And they have a Tatsu or a gap closing aggressive move. So we've seen Ryu's. Let's hop on over to Guilty Gear now. And we have Kai, my boy, who is the Shoto or all-arounder of this game. And let's take a look at some of his moves. And you'll notice that a lot of the Shotos have the move is the same input no matter the game. Like, for example, if I hit quarter circle or down forward punch in this game, Kai throws his projectile or fireball, or I guess in this case his lightning ball, but you know, you get the point. If I do the DP input or the Z motion, I get, what do you know, Kai's get off me or his reversal tool. This is what we call Kai's DP in this game. And if I do down back kick or quarter circle back kick, wouldn't you know it, I get a move that is an aggressive forward move that can dodge some things. You know what I mean? You see what I mean, right? It's the same inputs, the same idea and kind of all-arounder game plan, just with little differences. Let's do one more example to make sure you get what I'm saying. Now, real quick, if we hop on over to Grand Blue Fantasy versus Rising, I'm playing as Gran, the main character and Shoto of this game. If I do down forward punch, what do you know? I get a fireball. If I do the Z motion or DP motion, wouldn't you know? I get my invincible reversal / anti-air. And if I do down back kick, wouldn't you know it, I get a move that sends me forward and does some gap closing and damage. So that's pretty much the gist of it. When someone says Shoto, this is kind of what they mean. Someone that has all the basic tools and you can adapt your playstyle depending on what you need. If you need to be at range, use your fireball more. If you need to go in, use your gap closer more. And if the other guy is hitting too much buttons, use your DP or your anti-air more. Simple as that. Super good characters for beginners. And now I'm going to go over some Shotos in a bunch of different fighting games, just in case there's a specific game that you and your friends are playing that you want to get started in. Of course, for Street Fighter, you have Ryu and Ken. Ryu being the more defensive option here, and Ken being the more aggressive option, as we already talked about. Next up, for the Guilty Gear series, we have Soul and Kai. I guess Soul is kind of the aggressive one here, but due to the nature of Guilty Gear, you'll be pretty aggressive on both of them. But Soul and Kai are the Shotos or all-rounders for those games. Next up in BlazBlue, we have Jin and Ragna. Jin being the defensive one, a bit more like Kai, and Ragna being a lot more like Soul from Guilty Gear. Then in Under Night, we have Hyde and Akatsuki. I think Hyde being kind of the closest to your generic all-arounder. And then for something like Grand Blue, we have Gran, Jita, and Catalina. Catalina plays a lot more defensive, and Jita plays a lot more aggressive, with the main character Gran being kind of right in the middle. You might have noticed I haven't mentioned two pretty big fighting games, that being Mortal Kombat and Tekken, and that's mostly because they kind of play a little too differently to have Shoto archetypes. In Mortal Kombat, for example, everyone kind of has like a big anti-air move, with their down two always being the uppercut. But I guess Sub-Zero and Liu Kang would be the closest, all both having like a fireball, a horizontal move to cover the screen really quickly, and then they'll have their uppercut for a DP kind of thing. Skullgirls is a weird example because the Shoto of the game is technically DLC. Annie plays pretty close to like a rushdown Shoto with her projectile, DP, and some forward moving aggressive moves. But again, yeah, she's DLC. If you pick the main character of Skullgirls, it's a rushdown, not an all-rounder. So that one's a little weird. And then Tekken kind of has their own Shoto archetype called the Mishimas, but they're not really, I mean, they're all-rounders, but they're definitely not easy for beginner characters, especially if you happen to be picking Tekken 7. Yeah, you might want to avoid the two main characters at all costs if you're looking for an easy entry. Then, of course, there's games like Dragon Ball FighterZ that like kind of play so differently that all-arounders exist, but they're not really Shoto, so it's kind of complicated. I think you guys get the point though, and I covered pretty much all the Shotos for the big main games, so hopefully that's enough to get you started if you want to play the basic all-arounding archetype. And I mean, yeah, that's pretty much all for me. I hope you enjoyed this explanation, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. If you have an archetype or fighting game term that you don't fully understand and would like me to explain, please let me me know in the comments and I'd be more than happy to explain it. But that's it for me. I hope this one kind of helped you out and maybe gave you new players a place to start, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Have a good night.